Well, good morning, everyone. I have to tell you, I'm so grateful to be here today for two reasons. The first reason is when I first got into doing this research, actually, when I first went off to college to start collecting debts, my father was buoyed by the idea that someday I might come back and I might be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, something he thought would make a lot of sense. And when I came home from college and told him, Dad, I want to study the science of happiness, he sat me down. My father is a neuroscientist from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. And is that for Waco or neuroscience? Either way, it's great. And he told me the average scientific paper, the average scientific journal article is only read on average by 7 people total, which is incredibly depressing for a researcher to hear, because I know that statistic also includes my mom. So now we're down to 6 people who read these studies, which is a travesty, because what we've been learning about literally transforms what it means to be human. And what I feel like I've been doing for the past decade is studying exactly what I see happening here today, and I can't wait to tell you this research that validates who you are. The other reason I'm so grateful is we weren't sure what was going to go on this year, because during the Super Bowl, my wife's water broke. She said she wasn't getting enough attention, but it was two and a half months early, and we had actually thought we had lost this baby twice already, and the baby actually, she was born 3 days later in the middle of the book launch, so we prepared for the next 2 months, and we didn't even have a name for her, and we just got her out of NICU after 2.5 months, just a little over a month ago, and have her home now. So my wife said it was okay to come, because part of the reason is that this research, we got into battle test when life isn't easy. We can study happiness in a laboratory where we can control all the variables. That doesn't look like your life. It doesn't look like the messiness of life when you're up at 3 o'clock with a child that's crying, or in NICU with a baby, and then flying out the next day, where you're working to try to create happiness for your family in the midst of struggling with depression yourself. And what I want to talk about is how we can find ways of not only creating happiness for you, but how that happiness becomes one of the greatest advantages we could have within our life that triggers all these successes you heard from these incredible women already here today, and also ways that we could ripple that happiness out to other people to activate them to make the same choices that you've been making as well. So I want to start all this research at the beginning. I want to start my talk today where I started my TED Talk, and then we'll deviate completely from there, but I want to get everyone on the same wavelength. But I started all this academic research when I was just 7 years old. So if any of you have children and they're 7 and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. But when I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, I was 2 years older than my sister at the time, and we were playing up on top, and I'm 2 years older than her now, but at the time that meant she had to do everything I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war, so we're up on top of these bunk beds. How many of you had bunk beds growing up? I just loved them. I would still have them now if they were socially acceptable at all for a married guy. So on one side of the bunk bed, I had all of my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up, and on my sister's side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns lined up for this cavalry charge. And I wasn't too concerned about what was going to happen. I'd won this war every single time we'd played in the past, so if I was losing, the rules of engagement would change. There are differing accounts of what happened that afternoon, but since my sister was not invited to come speak with you here today, you get to hear the true story. Which is my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side, and somehow, without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor, and I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and saw that she had landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. And I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that Amy and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I had accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before this. Don't take her side, you don't know her. But I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw in my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had just settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. If you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please, please, please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that.
Oh my God.
She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face, and I had no idea where else that was going. That was the extent of the strategy. So I blurted out the only other thing I could think, which, Amy, I think this means you're a unicorn. Which was completely cheating, because there's nothing in the world Amy would have wanted more in that moment. To not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option that was open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see in my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict as her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she experienced falling off of a bunk bed, or contemplating this newfound identity as a unicorn on the other side. And the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents with all the negative consequences that were about to ensue for me, instead a smile spread across her face, and she bounded right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn. With one broken leg. But what we stumbled across at that tender age of 5 and 7, we had no idea at the time, was something that was going to be at the vanguard of a scientific revolution we're lucky enough to be living through right now. We're living through twin revolutions. We're living through the technological revolution that everyone knows about. Smartphones, smartwatches. But hidden behind the technological revolution is a human revolution that I see happening here today, here in the stadium. That human revolution is based in part on some of that technological revolution. Because for the first time in human history, using neuroimaging, we can peer behind the curtain to see what your brain is doing as you're architecting a picture of your world, of reality, of your family, of your work. And what we found is your brains are amazing. Your brains can process about 40 bits of information every second. The only problem is your brain's receiving 11 million pieces of information every second from your nerve endings. So what is really happening is as you're processing the world, your brain is only processing a few snowflakes in the midst of a blizzard. Which means, and I know you've seen this, if your brain scans first for the negatives, the hassles, the complaints, the frustrations, the threats, the fears first within our life, our brain has no resources left over to scan the world for the things we're grateful for in the present moment. The meaning involved with the relationships we have, or a way that we can make this world a better world for all the people that don't get to be in the stadium right now. What we stumbled across is this idea that it sounds as if scientifically happiness could be a choice. But here's the problem. If you have children and they're sitting in a high school science class during the week, we're telling them you are your genes and your environment. Whatever you were born with that predisposes you to intelligence and creativity and depression and obesity. And your whatever happens to you in a school, that's your environment. Whatever happens to you in a family or in a workplace. And that's all humans are, is genes and environment. But when we did this research for the past 2 decades, what we've seen is a completely different picture of what it is to be human. Genes and environment set the baseline, the initial baseline. And the average person, which is what we study in science, doesn't fight their genes or their environment. But when people make small changes to their life, when they choose to believe in themselves, when they change their daily behaviors and patterns, when they change the way that they interact with other people, when they change the thought processes they have, turns out we can break the tyranny of genes and environment over the trajectory of that person's levels of optimism and hope and happiness. And when we do that, every single educational outcome and business outcome rises dramatically. Happiness is the best thing you could possibly give to a brain to jumpstart the success rates we were looking at. But as soon as we talk about happiness, everyone gets the wrong idea. They immediately start thinking about pleasure. Like I'm supposed to be smiling all the time in life. And if life isn't always fun, then I'm clearly not happy and I'm doing something terribly wrong. That's pleasure. That's so short-lived. It's not worth us talking about here today. What I wanted to talk about, I think you've just heard in these incredible stories right before mine, that what we found is happiness. If happiness is pleasure, you pursue it one way, and it never works out. But I got started back at the divinity school. I was studying Christian ethics and comparing them to Buddhist ethics, looking at how your beliefs about the world change what decisions you make, why you wake up in the morning, why you work so hard, why we connect to other people. And what I found is that the ancient Greeks didn't define happiness as pleasure. They define happiness as the joy you feel moving towards your potential. I think that this sounds definitional. I think that's actually one of the most important parts of this talk. Because I think that so many people you're going to be talking to will think about happiness should be fun and just pleasurable. But if happiness is the joy you feel moving towards your potential as a human being, your potential in terms of your body, your potential in terms of relationships, if it's joy you feel moving towards that potential, there's two really important things that start to emerge. The first one is the joy is something you can experience even when life is not pleasurable. You go on a long run, your legs might be burning, but you can still feel joy as you see what your body's capable of. You work 8 to 9 months building a business, you're gonna have overflowing inboxes, high levels of stress, high levels of uncertainty and fear, but in the midst of that, you could experience joy as you watch your hopes come to life, or you see your strengths start to emerge. Even in the midst of childbirth, not high levels of pleasure all the time, right? But moments of joy that could correspond with some of the highest levels of pain and fear we can have. The other side of it is, I think we've become afraid of happiness as a society. I think many of the people we talk to around us are afraid of happiness because they think if I'm too happy, maybe I won't push so hard to be so successful. Or maybe if my kids are too happy, they're gonna slack off in school. Or if we're too happy, maybe we won't fix some of the problems we need to fix within this world, like the inequality or the discrimination. That's what pleasure does. Joy is the complete opposite to the human brain. Joy turns on your brain to its highest possible level. It triples your problem-solving abilities, dramatically improves your creativity and intelligence, raises every single business and educational outcome. All of the stories you heard here this morning started with somebody making the choice to believe in themselves, to choose to create happiness, and out of that, the success arose. What we're finding is the pattern that we thought about how if you're successful, then you'll be happier, wasn't working. And what I want to talk about today is how we can change the pursuit of happiness, not only for ourselves, but for others, to see not only our small potential, but our big potential for happiness in every single dimension of our life. But last year I was out speaking to a group of CEOs out in Northern California, all CEOs of top software companies. And afterwards, one of the CEOs came up to me and he offered to drive me to the airport to talk about this research, and so I agreed, and I got into this guy's really nice sports car. I don't know what it was. The doors went up instead of out, and I got in and figured out how to close the door and put on my seatbelt. He immediately started telling me his company had been growing so quickly over the past 3 years, his stress levels had been skyrocketing. And as he was speeding towards the airport and weaving all over the road, and I was holding on for dear life, wondering why I got in the car with this guy, that bell was going off in his car, the seatbelt bell. And eventually it stopped going off. It got tired, and I turned to him. I was like, "I'm sorry, but you don't wear seatbelts?" He said, "No, Sean, I listened to your talk. I love your research. I'm an optimist," and kept driving.
Oh, God.
I was like, "No, you're an idiot." But I'd love to work with you, sir. Optimism is great for a lot of things. It doesn't stop cars from hitting us. It doesn't stop reality from being hard, right? Optimism is what happens after the reality has become hard. Optimism is the belief that your behavior matters when life isn't necessarily going your way. It's not that the optimism will shield you. Everyone in this room knows somebody who's incredibly optimistic, who's incredibly positive, and bad things still happen to them, to their families, or to their business. What we're looking for is not to sugarcoat the world. What we want to do is create what sociologists call rational optimism. Because if we sugarcoat the present, that's what we call irrational optimism. If you sugarcoat the present, we make poor decisions for the future because we don't know what we're actually dealing with. When you sugarcoat the present, people around you stop believing in your leadership and in your advice. And as a result of that, what we find is that we don't make the changes we need to. Rational optimism is what I heard over and over again here this morning. Rational optimism starts with realism. A realistic assessment of the present. What's going on in your finances? What's going on in the world? What's going on in your body? It starts with realism, but you maintain the belief that my behavior matters if linked to other people. That seems to me the definition of why you're here today. And it's the reason why when people have that approach, we simply see extraordinary changes occur, not only in their life, but in other people's lives. I'm told over and over again when I go out and speak, I hear it at coffee breaks after my talk sometimes. They're like, "I didn't need to hear a happiness talk, I'm already happy." But you can't change other people, you know what I'm saying? There is no research over the past 100 years that proves that cultural myth. I hear it everywhere. People believe you can't change other people. Literally every single scientific study proves the exact opposite. When we have an intervention that changes that person and we have a significant result, we change you. We can change your response on surveys simply by flipping the questions. We change people literally all the time. Those same people that say you can't change other people, a few minutes later will be complaining about the negative effects of negative people within their lives. What we're finding is if the negative can affect us, the positive can as well. So what I want to talk about is how do we actually pursue happiness that starts by believing in you, that raise every single one of your success rates, but actually links back out to the people who aren't even here right now. In order to show you that, what I'd love to do right now is the largest positive psychology experiment we've ever done live, if you're willing to participate. You don't have to do any of my experiments today, because I'm not allowed to bring consent forms to talks anymore after the electric shock problem we had a couple times ago. But if you're willing to participate, all I need you to do is to please partner up with someone that you're sitting next to. Please partner up into pairs of 2. The only caveat is I'm legally required to tell you that you cannot partner up with someone that you're married to for this experiment, or that you wish you were married to. So move around if that's a problem for you. Into pairs of 2.
Did he say you can't move?
And introduce yourself.
With someone that you wish you were married to.
So I can't.
Does everyone have a partner?
It's so rude.
Of non-marriageable material? So here's what I need you to do.
You can't partner with
The person sitting closest to this side of the stadium, you're person number 1 in the pair. The person furthest from that side of the stadium, you're person number 2 in the pair. If you're equidistant from that side, you're front to back, the person closest to me is person number 1. If neither of those apply, you can pick one person to be number 1. Raise your hand if you're person number 1 for this experiment. Raise your hand if you're person number 2. Okay, that's not the experiment. We have to do this now because I did this experiment on Wall Street a few months ago, and it literally took that bank 5 minutes to figure out who number 1 in the group was. which explains what's going on there. So here's what's interesting. How many of you are psychology friends? You have a psychology degree, read a lot of psychology books. Oh, wonderful. So for my psychology friends, this is the emotional prime of the experiment. And for everyone else, this is nothing.
This is nothing.
Over the course of your life, you've taken your genetic predispositions, your genes, and you build those genes up for your self-discipline and your self-control. You were able to pass the classes you needed to in school to get into the jobs you wanted to apply yourself to your work here. What I'd love for you to do is use all that self-discipline and control that you've been cultivating for decades, and I'd like you to use it to control your behavior for just 7 seconds with your partner if you can. At 8 seconds, you can do whatever you want to or with your partner, but for 7 seconds, we need you to control yourself. So person number 1, when we ask you to do in this experiment, person number 1, what we ask you to do in this experiment is to not get angry with person number 2 when they do to you what I'm about to tell them to do to you.
Oh no.
Person number 1, don't get angry, don't get sad. Please, please don't cry like the group a couple weeks ago. That was so embarrassing. That was at the Pentagon. So I basically need you to do nothing with your partner right now. So person number 1 and 2, please turn and face one another. Person number 1, make sure you're within striking distance of person number 2. And person number 1, just go neutral on the inside. Try to feel no emotions and try and think no thoughts, which after waking up at 4:30 in the morning like some of you did, that should be very easy for you right now. Then person number 1, don't move your hands from this point in the experiment, even to defend yourself from person number 2. And person number 1, just go neutral on your face. Some of you take off your glasses, that's a great idea. And person number 1, just go neutral on your face. Show 0 emotion on your face. No fear, no flinching, no frustration, 0 emotion. Person number 1, once you're ready, using your decades of self-discipline and control to control your thoughts, your emotions, your hands, and your face. Then person number 2, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. And for the next 7 seconds, person number 2, please smile genuinely and warmly, but directly up into the eyes of person number 1 while looking at them as warmly and as deeply as possible. Ready? Go.
We do this with my daughter. It's not daughter. Oh. I try to tell her, like,
and stop.
How'd it go?
So I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We're gonna need to do that one more time.
We tell her not to smile, and then we like.
Person number 2, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were the one with all the power and control in this relationship. So let's just switch around. Now, my few psychology friends know you never repeat a psychology experiment with deception in it, but let's just try it. Person number 2, go neutral on the inside. Feel no emotions, think no thoughts, control your face with your decades of self-discipline and control. Person number 1, please look at them. Make sure you're looking at them directly in the eyes. For the next 7 seconds, it's your turn for retaliation. Please smile genuinely and warmly directly into their eyes. We'll give them as warmly and as deeply as possible. Go.
It's impossible not to laugh. Look into my eyes, damn it!
That's hard.
We do this with our daughter. We're like, could you last 10 seconds and they're smiling?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
And we're laughing and
My
smiling.
favorite
Yeah.
part about this experiment, my favorite part by far is as soon as I say stop, everyone in the room relaxes as if that was a difficult task to do. Some of you are like, I did it, you did nothing. For 7 seconds. Failure in this experiment, failure meant you smiled when I asked you not to. Success meant that you did not smile for the full 7 seconds. Raise your hand if you failed miserably in this experiment by smiling when you were not supposed to be smiling. You're in the look around the stadium, that's incredibly high. That's terrible, put your hands down. Raise your hand if you successfully did what I asked you to for the full 7 seconds.
You're dead on the inside.
Wow. I can't quite see everyone, and I can't count all the liars. So here's what we're gonna do. I can tell you, we've done this experiment now in 51 countries across the globe. 80 to 85% of people worldwide cannot control themselves for the 7 seconds of this experiment. I've done this with senior level bankers, all men, all in their mid-50s, in Tokyo, Japan. The smile percentage was in the mid-70s. Extraordinarily universal response. That this experiment, which in this form is predictive of nothing, it illustrates something that transforms what it means to be human, and we never get research like that. What we discovered by accident is if you put me into an fMRI brain scan and scan my brain while I'm smiling, small portions of my brain will show activation saying, Sean, you're smiling, which we knew had happened, I'm smiling. But if I stop smiling, but you keep scanning me, and you flash an image of one of you smiling at me, small portions of my brain, the mirror portions of the brain, will start to activate, and they say, Sean, you're smiling. But I'm not smiling, you're smiling. Before I can stop myself, my brain drops a neurochemical, most of you know, dopamine, into my system, raising my levels of happiness and enjoyment, and causing my face to contort into a smile before I can stop myself. You might have seen this happen here today, this mirror response. If you were looking at your partner while you were smiling at them, and their lips were quivering while they were trying not to smile.
Yeah, you were totally doing that.
That's weird, that actually shouldn't be happening. What's happening there is that their mirror neurons are fighting against the motor neurons. Your brain thinks it's smiling already. It's like, what's the problem here, face? You've seen these before. If you've ever had to speak to a group of people and one person starts to yawn and then other people start to yawn, that's not because you're boring. That can't possibly be it. I keep telling myself, what's happening there is as I see people in my visual field start to yawn, my mirror neurons tell me I'm the one that's yawning. And I can pick up the fatigue response with somebody sitting all the way across the room. Where this gets fascinating is if you have 15 strangers waiting for a plane, they don't even know they're part of an experiment, they're just waiting at their gate for their plane. You introduce an undercover researcher, stand in the middle of the 15 people in a 5-meter radius, and the undercover researcher just bounces nervously in place. Tap his foot impatiently on the ground and look at his watch repeatedly with a frown on his face. Within 2 minutes of waiting for that plane or train, depending on the study worldwide, on average, 7 to 12 of the 15 individuals will unconsciously start shifting nervously in place and or tapping their foot on the ground and or looking at their watch more than 4 times in a 2-minute span of time. If you don't believe me, this is one of the experiments you get to try out yourself the next time you get on a plane. If you want to spread stress and negativity to the people on your plane. Which is why I always do this one at a different gate. But the reason I love this experiment is because it shows us not only do smiles and yawns spread, but it turns out that negativity, stress, uncertainty, and anxiety, you can pick up like secondhand smoke. You don't even have to be the one smoking to have the negative health implications, right? The same thing is true with how people around you, their brains, are processing your world. Now, as soon as I tell people that, they make a mistake. They immediately think, I have to shield myself from these people immediately. I have to cut these people out of my life. Can't hang out with that guy anymore. I'm defriending her on Facebook, and when I get home from this conference, I can't even look at this person, which is awkward because I'm married to them. If that was somebody's response, what they're doing is they're eliminating social connection. And you get it. You get it. If somebody's currently negative, they're expressing suffering. We've all been there. If we've gotten isolated at that point, we exacerbate the problem, but we're all connected. So it turns out we made the entire system cancerous. I think that there's a more powerful way, and I think you're leading this movement to try and not only help ourselves, but to be able to help other people to see their true potential, because it turns out we're more linked than we ever thought we were. When my daughter Zoe Her middle name's Sparks, because we thought we lost her twice, and then we thought we were going to lose her again, and so she's a spark of life multiple times along the way. When Zoe Sparks came into the world in February, was the same week that I had a book come out called Big Potential. And I'm mentioning it because it was the same topic that I was just looking at, because as soon as I had kids, I realized that this pursuit of happiness that I was trying for, that I've been studying with the Happiness Advantage, was really not just an individual choice. It was an interconnected choice. When I choose to be more positive and grateful in the midst of all the things that are going on in the world or in my life, I give other people license to see the things that they're grateful. And when they're being grateful and positive around me, it makes it so much easier for me to be choosing to be positive in the midst of that. So that there's a cycle that starts to occur within that system. But the reason I want to show you that mirror neuron experiment here today is because it means that we've been studying you completely wrong in personal development for 40 to 50 years. And the reason for that is we got so focused on studying individual traits that we forgot that when you choose to believe in yourself, how much it impacts the entire ecosystem of potential around you, the people within your lives, your family members, and your friends as well. And what we were missing out on was how connected we actually were. So I start Big Potential with two stories, and I'm going to go back to the Happiness Advantage, but I want to tell it because as I listened here this morning, I realized Big Potential is the story of you and what you've been attempting to do and why you've been so incredibly successful. So, two research studies. The first one sounds incredibly boring until you think about it. The first one were two researchers in Virginia had people look up at hills they need to climb. And what they found by accident is that if you're looking at that hill by yourself, judging how steep it is, your brain perceives a mountain that's 10 to 20% steeper than if you were looking at that same mountain while standing next to a friend 3 feet apart from them. Think about that for just one moment. That shouldn't be happening. We just assume that there's a mountain, I see it, and I can determine whether or not to climb it. What we know from science is the mountain you see by yourself is 10 to 20% steeper than the mountain you see while standing next to a friend who's going to climb it with you. That changes everything. That's why you've been so successful, not just creating individual points of light, but trying to get people to shine brighter together. Because what you're realizing is those challenges, not just the physical challenges we have to overcome with our lives, but those mental challenges of believing in yourself, those emotional ones, the social ones, the political challenges we see, change if we think we're in this alone or with other people. Which to me is why the coaching transforms this individual pursuit of happiness where I go to the gym all by myself to this idea that I'm actually pursuing happiness with other people. The conclusion of Big Potential is happiness is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. We know this because our brains are actually wired. We're not just wired. If you look at people right now, part of the reason we got confused is there's no wires connecting any of your brains. You can scatter across the world after this. So we've studied, here's your intelligence, your creativity, your drive, all of these traits, but it turns out, you know that the way we test creativity is we put you into a laboratory by yourself and ask you how many uses of a brick you can think of in 5 minutes. That's the standard test of creativity in psychology. But all of you know you're more creative when you're around certain people in your life. You're funnier when you're around certain people. If you're an introvert, but you put somebody in a room with higher introverts, they act like an extrovert within that group. When we feel positive, we might be more extroverted than when we feel in a fearful state. Those are genetic ones too. We shouldn't be seeing those change, but it turns out that the people around us are constantly changing us all the time. Not only in terms of those challenges we need to get, but also in terms of our success rate, which is the second story from Big Potential I want to tell you about, because it seems to me to prove why you're actually so important. In 1935, there was a biologist going down the river in southeast Indonesia, and he was supposed to get back to his base camp before night fell because that's when all the predators come out, and he didn't make it back in time. So he's going down this river in the nighttime, looking up these trees, waiting for predators to jump out at him, and he looked up at one of the trees, the mangrove trees lining the river, and got struck by lightning. And then, as lightning never does, he was struck twice. And then in this reality-bending moment, just imagine this, you're on this river, and then suddenly every single tree for 100 yards down the river on one side got struck by lightning at the exact same time. Once his faculties recovered, he realized they weren't getting struck by lightning. It turns out that they were covered with billions of bioluminescent lightning bugs that for some reason were lighting up at the exact same time. So I live in Dallas now, and when the fireflies are out, they light up individually. So you chase them with your kids, they light up, and then you lose it, and you follow another one that's lighting up in these seemingly random moments, because that's how they evolved. That's how they thought they'd be most successful. So this biologist went back to the US, wrote up this scientific paper called The Miracle in the Mangroves, the case of the synchronous lightning bugs in Southeast Indonesia, and no one believed him. Because biologists said the whole point of being a lightning bug is to light up in the dark. Why in the world would you light up when other people are lighting up? Because it decreases your chances of reproduction that night. Because the whole point of lighting up is to increase your chances of reproduction. So, and mathematicians said this is impossible. For order to come out of chaos, someone has to lead it. So who's the lightning bug going, now, right? There is none of that happening. So it's biologically, mathematically, scientifically impossible. 8 decades later, we know exactly why it was possible. 2 researchers at MIT found that if lightning bugs light up individually, which most of them do worldwide, their success rate in reproduction per night is 3%, which is still pretty high. But it turns out that if the lightning bugs figure out how to time their pulses to the millisecond with the other bugs around them, as they do in Southeast Indonesia and one portion of the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, it turns out the success rate for those individuals goes from 3% to 82% per bug. Right? It's not like one bug's doing really well in the system, right? The success rate of the entire group was orders of magnitude higher than we thought it was possible. 3% we thought was the cap for how good you're doing as a firefly. But that's because they were lighting up individually. As soon as they timed up their pulses, which we didn't know that they even should do that, it turns out that their success rate went from 3% to 82%. As I've studied individuals, coaches, companies, and schools around the world, what we've been finding is the exact same pattern. When we stop trying to light up individually, hyper-competing with one another, and doing hyper-comparison on social media, which is why we've seen the rates of depression for every single age group double over the past decade, in the midst of high antidepressant use. Where we're finding anxiety rates are at the highest level we've ever seen in schools. Suicide rates for every age group, including 8-year-olds, has doubled. We've done something wrong in our pursuit of happiness. We all know people, and we've been people like that. And I think the reason for it is we've been pursuing happiness by ourselves. Instead of realizing that if you really want to see how bright you can shine, you actually have to get the other people around you to start to shine as well. To find a way in the darkness of not shining bright alone, but shining bright together. When we see those patterns emerge, amazing things start to happen. So as we looked at this interconnected approach, post-Hurricane Katrina, I got to work with a group of hospitals down in Louisiana. Hospitals have a very difficult time, because if you go into a hospital, you don't want to be there, right? So how do you raise people's levels of happiness when you're in a hospital surrounded by people who are sick and you're sick as well? So we went out to see what companies did that had amazing customer service. One of them was the Ritz-Carlton, and we went out and we found that they do something that I didn't know about before this. They train their employees in the hotel hallways to do something called the 10-5 way, which is if you walk within 10 feet of an employee at the Ritz-Carlton, they're trained to make eye contact and smile at you. Within 5 feet, they're trained to say hello. It's called the 10-5 way, and it's actually really fun to go in and out of those spheres with them, even if you're not staying there. What we did was, we imported that idea down to the group of hospitals. We trained 11,000 doctors, nurses, and staff to do this simple smiling experiment. Now, to be honest, anytime you try to create positive change, people are going to push against you. Some of the doctors said, you hired us to save people's lives, we make you a ton of money, don't tell me how to walk up and down the hallway. I'm not doing the stupid smiling initiative from HR. We said, you don't have to. This is an opt-in program coming from the CEO. And 11,000 people opted in. But some of the doctors still were stubborn, which is fine, because we're socialized to reciprocate. If you get into an elevator while you're here with someone and they smile and say hello to you, you don't slam up against the side of the elevator most of the time. You usually say hello back and then pull out your phone. What we've been finding is that's exactly what was happening in the hospital hallways. The doctors, the nurses, the staff were starting to at least reciprocate. None of this is interesting yet, because we haven't gotten back to patients. The patients coming to the hospital post-Hurricane Katrina, they didn't go through a training. They're not doing personal development that talk about this 10-5 rule is not part of their daily habit patterns, but as they walk into this hospital, as you videotape and observe, these patients are walking in for the first time, they don't just reciprocate the 10-5 way that's coming from the doctors, nurses, and staff. They actually start initiating it with other patients and with those stubborn doctors, starting to create this pattern, something that they hadn't even done themselves. Now that'd be a cute story about how you can change hospital hallways. The reason we got involved with it is because we wanted to see if this impacted the quality of care, which shouldn't. It's smiling in a hospital hallway, not even in the operating room. Turns out, 6 months later, those hospitals had a significant rise in the number of unique patient visits. The likelihood of patients to refer that hospital based upon the quality of care that they received skyrocketed, and the doctors' engagement levels, their happiness levels, highest in a decade. That's a 1 second free behavioral change that resulted in tens of millions of dollars for the hospital, but more important, more people cared for, and better perception of quality care, and greater levels of happiness by the people providing it. What I got interested in, that's the weakest intervention we can do. What if we did something stronger together? What if you get more than 1 second with somebody you're coaching, or a family member, or somebody you're working with on a daily basis? Could we take somebody with a negative world and turn them into a rational optimist in the midst of it? Remember, we're told we can't change other people. Science proves the exact opposite, and the reason is we're actually interconnected together. Small potential is what happens when we treat happiness like self-help and put it in the self-help section of Barnes & Noble's. Happiness and potential are interconnected traits, which means we need to be pursuing it together. But it starts by believing in yourself, which is why every single one of the stories you've heard this morning started with the same way, which is exactly what we saw in the research, which is the part I wanted to tell you about now. So I grew up in Waco, Texas. I lived there for 18 years. When it came time for college, we didn't have money for college. I was a volunteer firefighter back in Waco, which was making no money, and I applied on a dare from some of the other firefighters to apply to Harvard, but we couldn't afford it. I wasn't valedictorian or anything like that. I got in, but then we couldn't afford it. 3 weeks later, I got a Navy ROTC scholarship, Navy scholarship that paid for the whole thing. And suddenly, because of the military, something that wasn't even a possibility became a reality. The only reason I tell you that, in addition to thanking the military, is because it flipped the research I'm about to tell you. Because when I arrived on campus, I found myself in classrooms full of people that were much smarter than me or better academically prepared than me. I could have felt bad about myself, but I remember sitting there thinking, I can't believe I get the privilege of being surrounded by all these people. These are future poets, philosophers, engineers. They were all talking about Facebook, but it was amazing. You could see on their faces the ones who saw their education as a privilege or as an expectation. Like they just expected to get there. If you see things as an expectation sometimes, instead of seeing life as a privilege, you interact in a completely different way. The students who saw their education as a privilege, they're the ones who get the best test scores. They're the ones who find the greatest levels of happiness there. They have the lowest depression rates and they get the best jobs afterwards. Turns out that seeing it as a privilege was actually one of the most powerful things that they could do. But after I graduated, I realized if I left, they're not letting me back in. So I just stayed and I lived in the dorms with the freshmen for 8 years after I graduated. My mom was so proud. But in exchange for room and board, they gave me 30 freshmen, and you live in the dorms with them, and you counsel them during the first year of being there. You're basically a coach for them as they go through this challenging period. And what I noticed after 3 years, it's the same pattern emerged. No matter how happy they were with the success they had in the spring, getting into a school they wanted to go to, no matter how happy they were, 3 weeks later, after getting into the school, their brains weren't focused on the privilege of being there, nor fully focused on their philosophy or physics. Their brains become scattered, now thinking about the competition, the workload, the stresses, the hassles, complaints. What should have created great levels of happiness wasn't. 4 out of 5 Harvard students go through depression. 10% of the Harvard populace contemplates suicide once a year. That's stunningly high numbers. And what we started to realize was, now that I've done this research in 50 countries, this had nothing to do with Harvard. It had nothing to do with privileged Ivy League students. The story has to do with every single human brain in the world as you're contemplating the connection between your previous life successes or failures, how much happiness you think you're worthy of right now, and what you think will happen in your near and far future. Because when we start to think, so when I take my friends from Waco up to Harvard, the very first thing I do is I walk them into this freshman dining hall, which has these vaulted wooden ceilings, Tiffany stained glass all along the sides. It looks like something out of Hogwarts from the movie Harry Potter. And they roll their eyes at it and they say, why are you wasting time studying happiness here? Aren't you in the slums of Venezuela, or an impoverished school in Africa, or in a children's cancer ward? Since then, I've been in all those places. 2 years ago, I was out at St. Jude Children's Hospital learning from some of the doctors why it is that 4-year-old children with terminal cancer are more likely to tell their parents everything's going to be okay instead of the reverse. Why do we have access to resilience in childhood that we sometimes lose in adulthood? And how do we import that to soldiers coming back from combat services? It's not what we get to talk about here today, but I feel passionate about some of that research line. But the reason I want to tell you that is that they assumed that if a kid is at Harvard versus in the schools I'm working with in Soweto, South Africa, the children there on dirt floors with no books are going to be much less happy than the children at Harvard or the students at Harvard. And what we found is that's not the case at all. If I know your external world, if I know everything about your external world, how much money you make, where in the world you live, what the weather's like outside, how many degrees you have, if you're married or not, if you have kids or not, if I know all that information, I can predict 10% of the happiness variability between you and the person that's sitting next to you. Only 10% of the change. 90% of your happiness is based upon how your brain processes the world around you. How do you process your spouse? How do you process your body? How do you process your friends and what's going on in the news? If we could change that lens, some remarkable things start to happen. And that's why we realized that we were making a big mistake as we pursued happiness. We were thinking that once I'm successful, then I'll be happier. But when we started seeing this research, something different emerge. 4-year-old children, if you have 4-year-old children, they split them into 2 different groups. Prime one of the groups of children to think of a happy memory, leave the other ones in a neutral category, then have them put blocks together. Children at positive put blocks together 60% faster and more accurately than children in the neutral category. Why? Happiness shouldn't affect spatial memory. They're separate parts of the brain. But then we found out you prime a doctor to become more positive, he or she is 19% faster and more accurate at coming up with the correct diagnosis. That should have been health industry changing, but only 7 people read these studies. Then we found out that if they went into MetLife amongst the sales force, people that are trying to raise their sales at MetLife, this insurance company, and they measured who were the optimists, and they found that the top 10% of optimists amongst the group, the top 10% of optimists were outselling the other 90% by another 89%. My guess is that if we test the people that come on stage, the superstars, the diamonds, if we tested them, I bet their optimism scores would be off the charts. But here's the thing, you might be thinking to yourself, I'm not currently an optimist. I'm born a pessimist. I practiced pessimism for 2 or 3 decades. What we're finding continually in this research is we can change, and where I'm going to lead us to at the very end is how we can actually change your genetic set point of optimism dramatically above where it would have been based upon genes if you give us 2 minutes a day in 21 days. That's how powerfully we're seeing this research work, and we can sustain it, getting people who are lifelong pessimists become lifelong optimists, changing the world. But the reason I'm going to tell you this, oh, by the way, at MetLife, they then hired people that were low on the industry standard test, basically IQ, but there were high on levels of optimism. It was $1 million gamble by MetLife, and it turns out by year 1, those people that had high levels of optimism, but not all that much smarts, the high level optimists, turns out their sales were 26% higher than the normal hires, and by year 2 is 57% higher. What we're finding is it's incredible, and part of the reason for that is when your brain is happy, 31% higher levels of productive energy. Likelihood of promotion rises by 40%. Turns out the same level of stress has a 23% drop in the negative effects of stress upon the body. I have to tell you this one because I know you're a health-related group. This is one of my favorite studies we've done, just really quick. We went out to UBS's bank in the middle of the banking crisis, and we looked to see how they were dealing with stress, and we turned out their stress response was actually causing their employees to become sicker. And the reason is they've come into a stress management program, and they say, did you know that stress is related to the 10 leading causes of death and disease in the world? Did you know stress is the #1 killer at work, according to the World Health Organization? Stress is catabolic, tears down every organ in your body, including your skin. So whatever you do, don't stress while you're at work, right? You even hear that research, and what does it make you feel? Stress, right? Because we just created a fight or flight response to the fight or flight response, right? The problem is there's great research showing how bad stress is. But and if you Google stress, you get Google images of people's heads exploding, right? That's our image of stress. But every single one of these success stories starts with stress. If you ask people what the most powerful and most life-changing moments of their life are, they're always stress-related. 90% of them are stress-related. So what we did is we went in, and there's an equal body of research coming out of Harvard and Yale and Stanford where they found that for some people, that stress, chronic levels, I'm not talking about youth stress, chronic levels of stress, it turns out it actually improves your immune system to its highest possible level. These people don't get sick when they have work, they get sick when they get time off. These are people where they release growth hormones to rebuild their cells faster than anything we see. Turns out that, I work with the military, and, I'll get companies that say, we're going through so much stress right now, we're gonna lose all these people. Then I go through work with the military, and they onboard you with boot camp, right? They onboard you with the most stressful situation possible. Because they know if you go through stress with the right lens and with other people, turns out you create these meaningful bonds that keep you in organizations for decades, right? You talk about the rest of your life, right? So what we were looking for, could we recreate these with people? So what we found was, we half the group at UBS, half of them we told them, stress is bad for you. Here's some tools to decrease stress in your life. The other group we told them, stress is actually enhancing if you use it the right way. Embedded within every stress is meaning. If I tell you someone's failing English, you feel zero stress. If I tell you your kid is failing English, you feel stress because there's meaning involved with that relationship. So what happens is, oftentimes we feel stressed, but we forget about the meaning. So what we get people to do is acknowledge the stress, reconnect to the meaning in it, and channel the emotional response towards that meaning. That overflowing inbox, that child that's struggling, that spouse that we're working with, that person we're coaching, it turns out when you see the meaning involved with it, same level of stress. Stress levels don't drop, stress is inevitable, but its effects are not. Turns out when you saw the meaning involved with stress, same stress level, but you saw a 23% drop in the amount of headaches, backaches, fatigue, and lower job effectiveness and burnout. Turns out that our mindset changes how stress impacts the body. All of this research comes down to this idea that we call the happiness advantage, which is when the brain is positive, every single business and educational and many of our health outcomes rise dramatically. But here's the problem. That's not the reason I wrote the happiness advantage. The reason I wrote it was most people, probably the people that you're coaching and that you live with, they think, if I work harder right now, then I'll be more successful. And as soon as I'm successful, think how happy I'll be. Think how often we do that. As soon as I'm a diamond, think how happy I'll be. As soon as I get married, think how happy I'll be, right? As soon as I graduate from school, think how happy I'll be. Or as soon as, I have $1 million in a nest egg, think how happy I'll be. Or when I get out of debt, right? Or once I have a six-pack. In the midst of all of those things, we think that once I have that success, then I'll be happier. And that's how we sell things sometimes. But it turns out, scientifically, that theory is broken and backwards for two reasons. The first reason is everyone in this room has had some successes, but every time you've had a success, what do? You change the goalpost of what success looked like. You wanted to get out of debt, great, but now you want to be able to afford a bigger house, right? And now you're surrounded by other people who have nicer homes. Or, we think as soon as I get a good grade in school, think how happy I'll be. And then we realize we need to go into a better school. And then once we finish that school, we realize I don't even have a job, right? And then you get that job and you hit your targets for 1 month. What if I double those for the next month, right? Or what if I double those growth earnings for the next? We keep changing the goalposts of what success is, right? So the problem is, in each one of those moments, every time your brain has a success, what are you going to do? You're going to change the goalpost of what success looks like. So if happiness for you is on the opposite side of success, you never get there. We keep running after something we'll never get. In science, you pushed it over the cognitive horizon. Your brain never gets there. But flip it around, which is exactly the stories you heard here. It wasn't like they were successful and then their happiness emerged. They chose to believe in themselves when life wasn't going well. In the midst of miscarriages, in the midst of being massively in debt, in the midst of stresses or fears, they chose to be optimistic, to believe their behavior matters, to create social connection, and to choose to create happiness within their life. And that is what created the great levels of success on the backside of it. We've got the formula backwards when we talk to people, when we coach people. It's happiness that leads to success. Success doesn't lead to happiness. To flip it around, or to summarize all this research in the happiness advantage, if your success rates rise for the next 5-year period of time, your happiness levels flatline. They don't move. And the longer you do that and realize it's not working for you, that's when depression starts to come as well. That's why we see it with all these celebrities. Flip it around, raise happiness in the present. Every single success rate, educational, business and physical rises dramatically for that person. So the question is, how do we choose happiness when life isn't going well, before we have the success? In order to study that, we had to study video games. How many people play the video game Tetris? A lot of you. Tetris, if you don't know, is a game where shapes fall from the ceiling, just like they do in real life, and you rotate those shapes around. And the goal of Tetris is to make straight lines. Harvard Medical School paid students to play Tetris for 5 hours in a row. At the end of the experiment, they realized they were screwing up the participants. One of the participants came up to the professor 3 weeks later, grabbed this old professor, turned around and said, "Professor, I need to tell you something. You're going to think I'm crazy, but after that experiment, where you made me sit in the basement of that laboratory for 5 hours playing that game, I walked out of the experiment, met up with one of my friends who walked into a supermarket, and she found me rearranging the bread on the shelves to make straight lines. She said, 'Am I crazy?' I said, 'Yes, you are. Please stop touching me.'" But it turns out she wasn't the only one experiencing this. There were other people that were dreaming about Tetris. Has anyone here dreamed about Tetris? We usually get 1 for 300 people. It happens. If you view the world through the same pattern for too long, your brain keeps it even if it's not working for you. It's called a Tetris effect. I know I'm going fast right now. This line, I think, is one of the important lines. If you view the world through the same pattern for too long, your brain keeps it even if it's not working for you. I think you've seen that with people you've coached, with ourselves, with our family members. You view the world through the same pattern for too long, your brain keeps it even if it's not working for you. So I went into work with a group of I went into KPMG to work with these tax auditors, trying to make tax auditors happier. And they spend 8 to 14 hours a day reading through tax forms, looking for mistakes and errors. That's their job, which makes them very good at their job. Then they get promoted, and levels of happiness drop dramatically. I came in to work with them, and one of the guys in the control group that we were testing came up to me and said, "Over the past 3 years, I've been getting about 20% less work done. I just don't find any happiness in my work. I'm struggling to find happiness in life." I said, "I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. What have you done to fix it?" He said, "I've tried everything. One day at lunch, I decided to sit down at my desk. I didn't go eat. I just sat there and I made an Excel spreadsheet." And I was like, "I don't think that's going to help you at all. You should be eating." He said, "No, I realized that this was impacting me at home. So I need to open up a dialogue with my wife. So I made a list of all the things I wanted to talk to my wife about. I made a spreadsheet of all the mistakes I felt like my wife had been making in our relationship over the past 6 months. So we could work on it together. I even prioritized it for her, printed the spreadsheet out, brought it home to my ex-wife, handed this to her." I listened to this guy tell the story, and what I realized was, this is not a bad person. This is someone who got stuck. He trained his brain to look for mistakes and errors, which made him outstanding at avoiding some things within his life. But when he became a leader of other people, all he'd been trained to do was to look for all these mistakes and errors on his team, nothing to praise or recognize. And when he came home, he was treating his wife and his son like a tax form. If I could just eliminate these flaws and blemishes, think how much I might love them now. What happens in those moments is that as we look at the world, trying to see those threats and hassles first, right? As we look for all the problems in our body that we want to fix, or as we look at all the deficits in our life, or all the flaws that our spouse or our kid might have, our brain becomes experts at scanning the world for the negative. The fact that we've been exposed for the past decade to 24-hour news cycles, they're negative, that our alerts we get on news are all negative, it turns out what happens is your brain, our brains, become experts at scanning the world to find all the barriers, all the fears, and all the threats first. And the problem is you stole those resources from the part of the brain that saw things you were grateful for. So what you get is an eclipse. That same world you were so joyful about as a child, that after a while, you're only able to process the negative and the threats and the frustrations. We miss out on the reason why we're grateful for the sun, or grateful for a friend, even though they're not perfect, or grateful for a spouse, even though they're not perfect, or grateful for a body, even though it's not perfect. And in the midst of that, what we're finding is, if we can devote those resources back to seeing the whole picture, what we get is this activation of happiness that creates an entire cascade of this advantage within our lives, which is where I wanted to conclude with, how do we actually do that? What we were looking for, I met up with the US Surgeon General a year ago, and we talked about, we get people to brush their teeth. What if we also added 2 extra minutes to everyone's life, where for 2 minutes they would do, we didn't call it a vital behavior, but we talked about a 2-minute happiness hygiene habit, that if they did this every day, like brushing their teeth, we could half the rates of depression, dramatically improve levels of optimism, and raise every single educational outcome we know how to test for. We have 5 of them. I'm only going to talk about 3 of them here today. We already know what they are. If we can get people to do one of them, we see massive change from pessimism to optimism. But they're about patterns. They don't work if you do it once, or twice at a conference, they only work at their daily patterns like brushing our teeth, which is why I messed up at American Express. American Express, I came in to work with them, and for 21 days in a row, I got them to think of 3 things they were grateful for in the middle of the banking crisis. 21 days later, no impact. That's why we research this. We got to figure this stuff out. We assume gratitude is good for you. Turns out it wasn't working, but I went back into the data and looked at what they were grateful for, and after day 3, they were just repeating. I'm grateful for my work, my family, and my health. And it's the same 3 things every day. If you say blessings before dinner, sometimes we become rote. Thank you for this food, amen. Instead of thinking about where the salmon came from, right? How this corn got on a truck to even get on our plate in the first place. And gratitude for the farmers that grew it and the truck drivers that got us there, right? We become rote, and what happens to the brain is you don't actually receive any sort of gratitude benefit in that moment, because you're not scanning the world, you're repeating. So what we got people do, 2 researchers, Emmons and McCullough, found that for 21 days in a row, you thought of 3 new things you were grateful for. They had to be new, and it wasn't just what you were grateful for, it was why. So if I say I'm grateful for my son, Leo, I don't benefit. If I say I'm grateful for my son, he gave me a hug yesterday, which means I'm loved regardless after this talk, that works. You do this for 21 days in a row, turns out, by day 22, people who test pessimists on our scales, which you can take online, there's tons of these scales now. Turns out if you take an optimism and pessimist test, if you test pessimists, you always test pessimists. That's how we know our metrics work. But suddenly, people who are testing pessimists, 21 days later, were testing as low-level optimists. That shouldn't be happening. That's the genetic one. You can't touch it. You're born a pessimist, you die a pessimist. That's the end of the story. That's what we had been taught, and it was completely false. We can change your optimism if you give us 2 minutes a day. That's it. You can even do it while you brush your teeth. 4-year-old children, they're predisposed towards pessimism. You do it around a dinner table for 6 weeks in a row, before and after school. 6 months later, they're testing as the low-level optimist. That's life-changing. That's so much better than that's my positive kid, that's my negative kid. What we're starting to realize is those kids that might be born with genes or an environment that led to pessimism can actually be changed if we create these daily patterns in our life. We didn't know it because no one was actually trying it. So it was about getting this daily habit of gratitude in. We did this at Orlando Health. Orlando Health is a Trauma 1 hospital. So we tried to do it at a group of people. They're incredible. Orlando Health, so some people said, well, we can't do this gratitude thing because we're a very serious business. So we went to a level 1 trauma center, and we got them for every meeting that they had. You could do this on phone calls. You could do this when you have meetups. They start with one thing each person was grateful for. After a while, they're like, why are we still doing this? That guy's gone. Why do we still have to keep starting our meetings like this? But every day they would do this, and it turns out 2 years after doing this, where they learned all this rich information about one another, 2 years later, the night Pulse Club shooting occurred, the 2nd largest shooting in U.S. history, 3 blocks down from them. And all the victims came there. It was their worst night they had ever experienced as a community. And the next morning, they started with gratitude. They started with gratitude because in the midst of the trauma, that is what was the glue that held them together. Because instead of just hearing the negatives about their world or the resource allocation at every one of those meetings for 2 years, they got one piece of positive information that they were learning about that person, deepening their social connection, which is the greatest predictor of long-term levels of happiness we have, which is why I think your work is so important. So 4 years ago, my son Leo was born. My wife said I was traveling too much, so, which I was. So she said, you can't go anywhere in February unless Oprah calls. 3 days later, Oprah called. I was like, that's amazing. Say somebody else also. And then 3 days after Leo was born, because he was born way late, I found myself in the backyard of Oprah's house talking about happiness research. I had never met a celebrity at this point. I thought I'd be cool. I wasn't at all. She had this redwood forest on her property, as one does, and you walk through it, and you see Oprah for the first time, and they have 3 camera crews ready for this beautiful and organic first meeting for the show called Super Soul Sunday, which if you've not seen Super Soul Sunday, it's the best show on television. It's incredible. So what they have, the 3 camera crews, and I saw her, my brain just turned off. I was like, no, I'm out of here. And she was like, Sean, 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 and I didn't know the protocol, like, Oprah, Oprah, Oprah. So I said nothing, but her hands were up, so I grabbed them. But I didn't know if we were doing a handshake or we were doing a hug, and we started rotating completely in a circle. They had to shut off the cameras for the first time in 10,000 interviews. If you ever see that Super Soul Sunday episode with me, where I meet her for the first time, that was the 2nd time. We had to do it. We had to do it again. But the The reason I tell you that is a few minutes later, she makes you feel so comfortable, you feel like you're the most important person in the world, which it's actually her. So we actually, so in this moment, like, I'm there with Oprah. I'm at her house in Montecito where they had all the mudslides later on, like talking about happiness. My son's just born, and as they broke down the cameras, I turned to her and I said, Oprah, I'm so disappointed because I really wanted to talk about how I went through depression, because it's so easy for someone to hear this research and be like, yeah, of course he's happy. He's a happiness researcher. He's married to a happiness researcher, right? His sister's a unicorn, right? Oh, and of course, think about your problems in life right now, and then just add in all the success that Oprah's had. Her wealth, her friends, and her houses. Gotta be easy to be happy if you're Oprah, right? Your problems, and now Oprah's wealth. Gotta be easy. She said, Sean, I went through 2 years of depression at the height of my career when I was making the most money, when Beloved did do all I wanted to, and I shattered. I told her I went through 2 years of depression. By the way, that proves how much this idea that success will lead to happiness formula is completely broken. If Oprah isn't happy, it's probably not going to work for us that success is going to lead to happiness. But the other side of it is, right, I told her I went through 2 years of depression while I was at Harvard teaching those freshmen how not to become depressed themselves. She turned back on the camera. We did a whole second hour that was so much deeper than the first, talking about how do you restart happiness when it doesn't seem like it's a choice anymore. I remember my very first journal that I wrote was, I don't remember feeling happy. I don't think I will ever feel happy again. It sounds melodramatic now, but that's how I felt at the time. The turning point for Oprah and myself was the exact same. Up to that point, I was good at checking off individual metrics. I can do this myself. I can get these grades. I can get into school. And when I got depressed, I was like, I can think my way out of this. I can overcome this all by myself. I don't want to burden other people. I don't need other people to solve this. And the more I did that, the further I went. Same with Oprah. She's like, I'm Oprah. Down she went. And it turns out the turning point for both of us was when we realized, and we reached out. For me, I reached out to my 8 closest friends and family individually and said, for 2 years I've been depressed. I don't know how to get out of this, and I really need your help. The groundswell of support was incredible. People were emailing me, calling me, meeting up with me, bringing me cupcakes. We haven't tested cupcakes, but they work. And it was just that support that was continually there. But that wasn't what changed it. And what changed it is, I think, the reason that you're here. The turning point for me was because as soon as I put down that perfect image where I was, completely fine without other people, as soon as I let that down and told other people what I was going through, it allowed them to tell me they were going through depression or anxiety or body image or issues or loneliness. And so what got me up in the morning was not, am I depressed or not? What got me up in the morning is I need to be there for my friends that are dealing with all these things. We created real mutual friendships, and by reaching out to that ecosystem of potential, we didn't get small potential, which is when you try to get out of depression yourself. What we started realizing was that we needed to do this together to actually see our full potential. Which leads us to the very last habit, which is the most powerful of all the ones we've looked at in a 2-minute form. Well, we got people to do it Facebook, and I'd love for you to do this with 15,000 people. This would be an incredible ripple effect. We got people at Facebook every morning to start their day writing a 2-minute email or text message praising or thanking one person in their life. Many of you already do this as well. A 2-minute positive email or text message praising or thanking one person in your life. We did this for 21 days in a row. Turns out their happiness levels skyrocketed. Their accuracy rates improved by 10%. Their levels of happiness rose dramatically. The reason for this is, if you do this, you can pick a different person each day for 21 days. I wrote to a high school English teacher and said, you were the reason I fell in love with reading. You're the reason I wrote a book. Thank you for changing my life. It took me 45 seconds to type. It took me longer to find that woman's email address online. If you do this for the next 21 days in a row, if you pull out a smartphone anytime here this afternoon or this morning, or you have one, write a 2-minute text message or email praising or thanking one person in your life. It might be the most valuable thing you've done at the entire conference, because what happens if you do it for 3 days in a row, your brain literally gets addicted to it, because you spend all day long thinking about how amazing you were for writing that email in the morning. You're like, I'm the kind of person who does this stuff, and you get great emails back because they don't know about the 2-minute maximum rule, so they keep writing about how great they think you are, and you're like, we should meet up. But 21 days later is the real value. 21 days from now, if we all came back here to the stadium and magically you had all done this for 21 days in a row, the ripple effect would be amazing. But the reason I want to tell you this is the biggest effect would be here in this room. Because your social connection score, this is where I want to conclude. Your social connection score is the breadth, the depth, and the meaning of your social relationships. And your social connection score is by far the greatest predictor of happiness. The greatest predictor of long-term happiness is your social connection score by far. which means we can't pursue happiness like it's an individual sport, because the greatest predictor of it is other people. Deep, meaningful, broad relationships with those people. And when people did this, if we all did this, turns out 21 days from now, we'd be in the top 10% of social sports scores worldwide, which is life-changing in a society where we've been hyper-competing, hyper-comparing so much that oftentimes we go onto Facebook wanting to feel loved, but it turns out flip it around and are giving likes and talking about other people's posts and talk about how great their babies or their vacations are. When you leave, your levels of happiness have risen dramatically over waiting to see if anyone loved you when they were on those types of things. What we're finding is as you spread it out, it raises your social connection score. And where I wanted to conclude is we just found out social connection is as predictive of how long you will end up living as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking. We fight so hard against the negative. We forget to tell people how powerful the positive is. And maybe one of the greatest health benefits you could be possibly giving to people is the social connection you're creating here and you're creating in the world outside of this. I remember lying on a floor in a bathroom at Harvard, so depressed that breathing hurt. I had no idea that someday I'd be able to find happiness, or I'd be studying happiness, or that I'd get the opportunity to even come to a stadium full of incredible people to talk about happiness. Because what I want to say is the story can change at any point. And what we're finding is these small, little habit changes, if we add those to your vital behaviors you do on a daily basis, we can tip this world away from negativity, stress, and uncertainty to a world that believes this behavior matter. Instead of trying to light up in the dark alone, we could shine brighter together. So thank you so much for who you are. Thank you for letting me come talk about happiness.